There are two people who started the exact same job on the exact same day. Same degree, same starting salary, same manager, same desk, same orientation packet with the same spelling mistake on page 4. 18 months later, one of them is running a small team. The other is still doing the job they were hired for, wondering quietly what happened. Nobody in that office would say the gap was about intelligence. Both of them were sharp. Nobody would say it was about effort either. The one who stayed behind worked just as many late nights, answered just as many emails at 10 p.m., cared just as much. So what actually separated them? If you ask people this question directly, most reach for the same handful of answers. Luck, connections, charisma, being in the right place at the right time. And each of those plays some role, some of the time, for some people. But none of them explain the pattern well enough to be trusted, because the pattern shows up too often in too many unrelated fields for it to be chance. Watch closely enough, over enough time, and a quieter explanation starts to surface. It isn't about how much someone knows on day one, it's about how quickly they're willing to be wrong. That sentence sounds simple. It might even sound obvious, but sit with it for a moment, because underneath it is something most people spend their entire career avoiding. Being wrong feels bad. It has always felt bad. For every human being who has ever tried something new, there is a very old, very deep part of the brain that treats being wrong the way it treats a physical threat. Flinch first, understand later. This is not a personality flaw, it's wiring. And it means that the ability to learn quickly isn't really a talent for absorbing information. It's a talent for tolerating the discomfort of finding out you were mistaken and doing something useful with that discomfort instead of turning away from it. This is the invisible skill sitting underneath almost every visible success story you've ever heard. Not raw intelligence, not privilege, though privilege matters, not even hard work, though hard work matters too. Underneath all of it is a mechanism, a way of processing correction that some people have quietly built, usually without ever naming it, and most people have never been taught at all. This is not a book about studying harder. It is not a book about productivity systems, reading lists, or the number of books a person consumes in a year. Those things can help, but they are not the engine. The engine is something psychological, something that happens in the half second after a person realizes they got something wrong. The half second that decides whether that moment becomes useful or gets quietly buried. By the end of this audiobook, you won't just understand why some people seem to absorb the world faster than others. You'll understand the specific mental habits that make it possible. Habits you can start noticing in yourself today and building deliberately from tomorrow. Not a personality transplant, not a talent you either have or don't. A set of learnable, repeatable behaviors that quietly compound year after year until the person doing them looks, from a distance, like they were simply born faster. There's a reason certain people, across industries, backgrounds, and starting points, keep ending up ahead. It isn't mysterious once you see it clearly. It follows something close to a pattern, a loop most of them run without ever consciously designing it. We'll build toward that loop together, piece by piece, until it becomes obvious in hindsight, the way all good explanations eventually do. But now, hold on to one idea. The gap between the two people who started on the same day was never about who knew more when they walked in. It was about what each of them did the first time they found out they were wrong. There's a version of this story most people have already accepted without ever questioning it. Somewhere they believe there are people simply born with a faster processor. They pick things up quicker. They read a manual once and understand it. They watch someone perform a skill and can nearly replicate it on the first try. We call these people naturals, and we treat the label as an explanation, when really it's just a description dressed up as one. It's worth asking why this belief survives so well, given how little evidence actually supports it. Part of the answer is that fast learning is easier to notice than to trace. You see the result, someone new to a role outperforming people who've been there for years, and your mind searches for the simplest possible cause. Talent is simple. It requires no further explanation. It closes the question instead of opening it. But close observation tells a different story, and it starts somewhere unglamorous in how people respond to correction. Picture two employees receiving the same piece of feedback from a manager. Their new client presentation missed the mark. Too much jargon, not enough of what the client actually cares about. Both employees nod, both say thank you. Both walk back to their desks. One of them spends the next 10 minutes turning the feedback over, not defensively, curiously. What was it about the presentation that read as jargon rather than expertise? Where exactly did the client's attention seem to drop? By the time they open their laptop again, they've built a small private theory about what happened, and they test that theory in the next draft. The other spends the next 10 minutes doing something almost invisible, even to themselves. They tell a quiet internal story about the feedback. The client didn't really understand what we were pitching, or my manager doesn't fully get this space. It isn't dishonesty, it's protection, and it works in the short term. It makes the discomfort of being wrong disappear almost instantly. 6 months later, one of them has revised their instincts a dozen times. The other has defended the same instincts a dozen times. Only one of them is actually learning. This is the part that rarely gets said out loud. Intelligence doesn't prevent this pattern. If anything, it can make it worse. A person with a sharp mind is often extremely good at constructing a reasonable-sounding story for why they weren't wrong. Cleverness, unmanaged, becomes a very sophisticated defense system. The smarter someone is, the more convincing their excuses can be, even and especially to themselves. So the real divide isn't between smart people and less smart people. It's between people whose intelligence gets spent making corrections and people whose intelligence gets spent avoiding them. There's a useful way to picture this. Imagine every piece of feedback, every mistake, every awkward moment of realizing you misjudged something as a small key. The key doesn't do anything on its own. It only matters if you use it to open something. A slightly better model of how things actually work. Most people receive the key and, without quite meaning to, drop it into a drawer they never open again. Fast learners aren't people who receive more keys than everyone else. They're people who almost never let one go unused. This explains something that puzzles a lot of thoughtful, capable people. Why they can work incredibly hard, read constantly, attend every training their company offers, and still feel like they're standing still while someone less experienced moves past them. Effort and consumption were never the bottleneck. The bottleneck was what happened in the moments they were shown they were wrong. Moments most people are trained, since childhood, to move past as quickly as possible. Think about how early this training starts. A child gets a math problem wrong in front of the class and feels the heat rise in their face. Nobody explicitly teaches them to associate being wrong with humiliation, but the lesson lands anyway, repeated enough times, across enough years, until adulthood arrives with the association fully installed. Being wrong equals being exposed. So the adult version of that child spends a career, often a very successful-looking career, quietly protecting themselves from ever feeling that exposure again, which means quietly protecting themselves from the exact moments that would make them better. None of this makes a person weak. It makes them human, shaped by biology and by every well-meaning classroom that ever existed. But understanding where the habit comes from is the first step toward loosening its grip. Because if speed of learning isn't a gift some people received and others didn't, if it's actually a decision made repeatedly in small private moments most people never examine, then it stops being something to envy from a distance. It becomes something available to build. That building starts somewhere specific, not in how much information a person can hold, but in what happens to their sense of self the moment they discover they were wrong. And that, it turns out, comes with its own quiet cost. One most high achievers are paying without ever realizing it. There's a strange pattern that shows up again and again among people who reach a certain level of success, and it rarely gets discussed openly because it doesn't look like a problem from the outside. It looks like confidence. Someone spends 10 years becoming excellent at something. They build a reputation. People start introducing them by their expertise, the strategist, the closer, the person who always knows the market. And somewhere in that process, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, their competence quietly merges with their identity. They stop being someone who is good at the work. They become the work. This sounds harmless. In many ways, it's even earned. But it comes with a hidden cost that only shows up later, in the moments that matter most. The moments when new information suggests they might be wrong. Consider a seasoned executive sitting in a meeting where a junior analyst, fresh out of school, presents data suggesting the executive's long-standing strategy is starting to underperform. The data is solid, the reasoning is sound, and yet something in the executive tightens almost before conscious thought catches up, not because the data is unclear, because if the data is right, the executive was wrong. And the executive isn't just someone who made a call. The executive is, in their own mind, someone who doesn't miss calls like this. This is the ego tax. It's the price paid invisibly every time expertise curdles into identity. And it's paid most heavily by exactly the people who can least afford to be wrong in front of others. Which means, ironically, the more accomplished someone becomes, the more expensive it gets for them to learn. There's a psychological reason this happens, and it has little to do with arrogance. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We don't just do things. We build stories about who we are based on what we do. Once someone has told themselves, "I am excellent at this" enough times, new information that contradicts it isn't received as a data point. It's received as a threat to the story. And the mind defends stories the way it defends anything it depends on for stability. This is why brilliant people sometimes make painfully obvious mistakes and refuse to see them, long after everyone around them already has. It isn't a failure of intelligence, it's a conflict between two systems, the part of the mind trying to understand reality and the part of the mind trying to protect a self-image. When those two systems disagree, self-image quietly wins more often than most people would like to admit. Watch for the specific language this produces, because it's remarkably consistent across industries. I've been doing this for 20 years. I think we're overcomplicating something simple. That might work in theory, but in practice, none of these phrases are dishonest. Often they contain real wisdom, but they can also function as a kind of psychological armor. A way of closing a question before it has to be fully examined, because fully examining it might mean discovering something uncomfortable. The people who learn fastest, it turns out, tend to have built a subtle but crucial habit. They've learned to separate their competence from their identity on purpose, not by becoming falsely modest and not by pretending their expertise doesn't matter. By quietly holding a different belief about themselves. Not "I am someone who is right," but "I am someone who gets it right eventually, because I don't mind being shown I wasn't." That distinction sounds small. It changes almost everything. Someone who believes their value comes from always having the right answer will experience every correction as a small attack on their worth. Someone who believes their value comes from their ability to update will experience the same correction as simply part of the process working as intended. Same feedback, same facts, completely different internal experience, and completely different speed of learning. There's a quiet historical case that illustrates this well. The shift many veteran physicians went through when new evidence overturned long-held medical practices, treatments they'd trained on, defended, and used for years. The ones who adapted fastest weren't necessarily the most current on the literature. They were the ones who had never fully fused their professional identity with being right in the first place. Being wrong for them cost less, so they paid the price sooner and moved on faster, while others held on to outdated methods long after the evidence had turned. This raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with for a moment. How much of your own resistance to feedback in any part of your life is really about the facts? And how much is about protecting a version of yourself you've quietly built over years, without ever examining whether it needs protecting at all? The people who learn quickly haven't eliminated their ego. That isn't possible and wouldn't be desirable even if it were. What they've done is smaller and more practical. They've loosened the grip between who they are and what they currently believe, just enough that new information can get in before defensiveness slams the door. That loosening doesn't happen by accident. It's built the same way any skill is built, through repeated exposure to a very specific kind of discomfort, one most people spend their whole lives arranging their circumstances to avoid. Which raises the next question naturally. If feedback is the raw material for growth, why do so many people, even when they receive good feedback, fail to actually use it? Every year, companies spend enormous amounts of money collecting feedback that almost nobody actually uses. Performance reviews get written, discussed, filed away. Customer surveys get tabulated into reports that circulate briefly before disappearing into a shared drive. Manager comments get nodded at in the moment and forgotten by the following week. The feedback exists. It's often accurate, and yet somehow it rarely changes behavior. This is strange if you think about it, because feedback is supposed to be the entire mechanism by which people improve. If it isn't working, something is breaking down between the moment information arrives and the moment it gets used. The break happens at a very specific point, and it's easy to miss because it happens so fast. Feedback arrives, and before a person can process what it actually says, they've already classified it. Not consciously, almost instantly, and almost always along one of two lines. This is useful information, or this is a judgment about me. If it lands as a judgment, something predictable follows. The nervous system responds the way it would to any social threat. A flicker of defensiveness, a mental rehearsal of a justification, a subtle urge to explain rather than absorb. By the time the explaining is done, the actual information has been filtered out, replaced by a story about why it doesn't fully apply. If it lands as information, something entirely different happens. There's no story to defend. The data simply gets absorbed the way a hand absorbs the sensation of a surface being rough or smooth, automatically, without commentary, without needing to decide whether the roughness is fair. This is the distinction that separates people who improve quickly from people who stay the same despite years of getting feedback. It isn't about how much feedback someone receives. It's about which of these two channels that feedback gets routed through. Consider a young chef working under a demanding head chef in a professional kitchen. Every night, dishes come back with corrections. Too much salt, plated carelessly, sauce broken. A chef who treats each correction as a referendum on their talent will spend real energy managing the emotional sting of each note. And that energy comes directly out of the attention that could have gone toward actually adjusting the dish. A chef who treats each correction the way a sailor treats wind direction, simply information about the current condition, requiring an adjustment, carrying no verdict about their worth as a sailor, will make the same correction in a fraction of the time and be ready for the next one before the emotional version has even finished feeling bad. Over a single night, the difference looks small. Over a 2-year apprenticeship, it's the difference between someone who becomes exceptional and someone who becomes competent and stays there. This is what it means to treat feedback as a second sense rather than a verdict. A sense doesn't insult you. Your eyes don't accuse you when a room is dark. They simply report it, and you adjust. You turn on a light. You wait for your vision to shift. Fast learners have trained themselves, often without ever framing it this way, to receive correction with that same neutrality. Not because they don't care, because they've separated caring about the outcome from taking the input personally. And that separation is what allows the input to actually be used. There's a reason this reframe is difficult, and it isn't a lack of willpower. Feedback almost always arrives wrapped in tone, timing, and delivery, and human beings are exquisitely sensitive to all three. A correction delivered impatiently registers differently than the same correction delivered warmly, even when the content is identical. Learning to extract the signal from the delivery, to hear the source broke clearly, even when it's said sharply, without your mind spiraling into "he thinks I'm incompetent," is a specific learnable skill. It is not the same as having thick skin, which implies not feeling anything. It's closer to having accurate hearing, where the emotional noise and the useful signal have finally been separated into two different channels. There's a quiet practice that seems to build this skill more reliably than almost anything else. The habit of asking one small question immediately after receiving any correction, before doing anything else with it. Not, "Was that fair?" and not, "How do I feel about that?" Simply, "What specifically is this telling me about what I did?" That question does something important. It interrupts the automatic slide into self-evaluation and redirects attention toward the only thing that was ever actually useful: the information itself. It's a small habit, almost embarrassingly simple, and yet it appears in some form in nearly every person who has been observed learning unusually fast in their field. What starts to emerge from this is a slightly uncomfortable realization. The feedback was rarely the problem. Most environments, even flawed ones, produce more useful correction than people actually absorb. The bottleneck was never a shortage of information. It was a filtering system built in childhood and reinforced for decades that quietly decided which information was safe enough to let through. Which means the real skill was never seeking more feedback, the advice so often repeated in career guidance. The real skill is learning to receive the feedback that's already arriving all day from managers, clients, results, and even silence, without the emotional tax that normally blocks it from landing. Once that filter loosens, something else becomes possible. Something that explains why certain people seem to improve steadily, almost invisibly, over long stretches of time, while everyone around them appears to plateau. Small corrections, absorbed consistently rather than resisted, don't just accumulate, they begin to compound. There's a peculiar illusion that shows up whenever people compare themselves to someone further along than they are. Two colleagues start careers at the same time, in the same field, with roughly the same starting ability. For the first year, nobody notices much difference. For the second year, one of them seems slightly sharper in meetings, slightly quicker to spot the right question. By year 5, one of them is being handed the difficult clients, the ambiguous problems, the conversations nobody else wants to have, and the other is still very good at their job, respected, competent, but somehow standing exactly where they started. From the outside, this looks sudden. It looks like one person took off while the other stayed level. But nothing about it was sudden. It only looked that way because the actual mechanism was invisible the entire time it was happening. Small corrections, absorbed consistently, behave the way interest behaves in a bank account. In any single week, the effect is too small to notice. A slightly better question asked in a meeting, a slightly faster recovery from a mistake, a slightly more accurate read of what a client actually wanted versus what they said they wanted. None of these moments feel significant. Each one, alone, is forgettable. But moments like this don't disappear. They accumulate, and more importantly, they build on each other, because each slightly better understanding becomes the foundation the next correction gets layered onto. The person who absorbed last month's feedback is standing on slightly higher ground when this month's feedback arrives, which means this month's correction reaches slightly further than it would have otherwise. Understanding doesn't just add up, it multiplies against itself. This is easy to state and hard to feel, because compounding is famously invisible in the short term and only obvious in hindsight. Ask someone in year one of this process whether they're improving faster than their peer, and they genuinely won't know. The visible evidence simply hasn't caught up yet to the invisible accumulation happening underneath it. There's a reason this matters more than it first appears to. Most people evaluate their own growth using the wrong time frame. They ask essentially, did I get noticeably better this week? And when the answer is no, they conclude the process isn't working. But growth built on absorbed correction was never designed to be visible weekly. It's designed to be visible in years, the way a small daily habit of exercise produces no noticeable change in a mirror after 8 days, and an unmistakable one after 8 months. This explains a pattern that confuses a lot of talented people early in their careers. Watching someone with seemingly average ability quietly overtake people who were clearly sharper when everyone started. The sharper person often assumes their natural edge will simply continue to show and stops paying close attention to small corrections because they don't feel necessary. The average performer, meanwhile, keeps absorbing every small piece of feedback available, month after month, without any single month feeling like a breakthrough. By the time the gap becomes visible to everyone in the room, it has already been building, quietly, for years. There's a specific danger worth naming here, because it catches even people who understand this principle intellectually. Compounding rewards consistency far more than it rewards intensity. A person who absorbs one useful correction every week for 3 years will typically outpace a person who absorbs an intense burst of corrections for one dramatic month and then coasts. This runs against a very common instinct, the belief that growth comes from occasional heroic effort, a weekend seminar, an intensive course, a New Year's resolution. Real compounding is quieter than that, and far less exciting to talk about, which is exactly why it gets underestimated so consistently. Think about how this shows up in something as ordinary as writing. A junior writer who receives one piece of substantive editorial feedback per week and genuinely absorbs it rather than defending against it will typically become a notably better writer within 2 years. Not because any single piece of feedback was transformative, but because 50 absorbed corrections, compounding against each other, produce a different writer than the one who started. Meanwhile, a writer with more natural talent who resists feedback, convinced their instincts are already good enough, can remain at nearly the same level for a decade. This is the part that should feel slightly unsettling, in a useful way. It means the gap between people who seem to have made it and people who feel stuck isn't usually explained by a single decision, a single opportunity, or a single stroke of luck. It's usually explained by hundreds of small, unremarkable moments where one person let a correction in and the other, understandably, protected themselves from it. Once this becomes visible, the natural next question isn't, how do I get more feedback? It's a slightly different one. Where does someone actually get access to this steady stream of correction in the first place? Especially once they've become experienced enough that people stop offering it freely? The answer turns out to involve something most fast learners do almost instinctively, and it isn't about waiting for correction to arrive. It's about actively going looking for other people's mistakes before making the same ones themselves. There's a question worth asking about anyone who seems to have compressed 20 years of learning into 10. Where did the other 10 years go? The easy answer is talent, and by now it should be clear why that answer doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The more accurate answer is less flattering and far more useful. They didn't spend those years avoiding mistakes. They spent those years avoiding mistakes other people had already made. This distinction is easy to state and surprisingly rare to actually practice. Most people learn almost exclusively from their own direct experience. Their own failed pitch, their own missed deadline, their own bad hire. Direct experience is vivid, memorable, and undeniably effective. It's also extremely slow, because a person only has so many hours in a career to generate it firsthand. The people who learn fastest have found a way around this limitation, and it isn't complicated, though it is uncomfortable in a specific way. They systematically go looking for other people's failures, mistakes, and hard-earned lessons, and they treat those second-hand experiences with almost the same seriousness they'd give their own. Picture a young operations manager at a growing company tasked with building a process from scratch. One version of this manager treats the assignment as a blank page, figures it out through trial and error, makes the predictable early mistakes, learns from each one as it happens. Another version, before writing a single procedure, spends real time asking people who've built similar systems what went wrong the first time they tried it. Not what worked, what failed specifically, and why. That second manager isn't smarter. They've simply borrowed several years of someone else's trial and error and folded it into their own starting position. This sounds obvious once stated plainly, which raises the real question: if it's this simple, why doesn't nearly everyone do it? The honest answer involves a small piece of vanity most people don't examine closely. Asking someone directly about their failures requires admitting implicitly that you don't already know something. And for many capable people, especially ones who've built a reputation on competence, that small admission costs more than it should. It's often easier, emotionally, to make the mistake yourself and frame it afterward as a valuable learning experience than to ask a direct question that might expose even briefly that you hadn't figured it out yet. Fast learners have simply made peace with that cost earlier than most people do. They've learned that the discomfort of asking a slightly humbling question is trivial compared to the years it saves. This habit shows up with striking consistency across very different fields. Investors who outperform over long periods tend to study failed companies and failed strategies with the same intensity they study successful ones. Often more, because a failure examined closely reveals the exact mechanism of what went wrong. While a success can be explained by dozens of competing theories, most of them wrong. Surgeons in training are taught deliberately through case studies of complications and errors, not just successful procedures, precisely because the mistake teaches faster than the clean outcome does. None of these fields treat failure as something to avoid discussing. They treat it as the richest source of usable information available, specifically because it's the one kind of information most people instinctively bury. There's a psychological reason second-hand failure teaches so efficiently, and it connects directly back to the earlier idea about the ego tax. When the mistake belongs to someone else, there's no identity to protect. Nothing about hearing that a former colleague's product launch failed because they misjudged their audience threatens your own self-image. Which means the lesson lands cleanly, without the usual filtering, at a fraction of the emotional cost of learning it firsthand. This creates an interesting asymmetry worth sitting with. Every failure that's ever happened to anyone, anywhere, in any field remotely related to yours, is a lesson available for free, provided you're willing to ask for it and willing to actually listen without needing to prove you already knew. Meanwhile, every mistake you insist on making yourself when it could have been avoided by asking costs you real time, real money, or real reputation, resources that don't come back once spent. This reframes what mentorship in its most useful form actually is. Not motivational advice, and not vague encouragement to keep going. The most valuable mentorship is almost always a specific, detailed account of exactly where someone else went wrong, offered without the polish that usually gets applied to stories told for an audience. The mentors people remember years later are rarely the ones who told them what to do. They're the ones who told them, honestly, what not to do, and why, specifically, they hadn't seen it coming. There's a discipline hidden inside this habit that's worth naming directly, because it's easy to underestimate. Actively seeking out other people's failures requires a kind of curiosity that has nothing to do with judgment. It means asking, what went wrong for you? The way a curious student asks a question, not the way a critic gathers ammunition. People can feel the difference immediately, and it determines whether they answer honestly or give you the polished version they'd give a stranger. Borrowed experience isn't a shortcut in the sense of skipping the work. It's closer to inheritance, receiving something someone else paid for at a cost you didn't have to pay yourself. The people who learn fastest simply understand that this inheritance is available almost everywhere, largely unclaimed because most people are too uncomfortable to ask for it directly. This still leaves an important gap unaddressed. Absorbing feedback, borrowing other people's mistakes, letting corrections compound, all of this requires a willingness to remain, for some stretch of time, genuinely unsure. And that particular discomfort, the discomfort of not yet having a clean answer, turns out to be the part almost everyone tries hardest to escape. There's a moment that happens dozens of times a day in almost every job that most people move through so quickly they don't notice it happening at all. Someone hits a problem they don't immediately understand. For a second, maybe two, there's a small internal flicker of confusion. And then, almost automatically, the mind reaches for the nearest resolution. Not necessarily the correct one, just the nearest one. A familiar explanation, a comfortable assumption, anything that makes the uncomfortable feeling of not knowing go away as quickly as possible. This reflex is so fast and so automatic that most people never experience the actual gap between confusion and understanding. They experience confusion, and then, almost instantly, something that feels like understanding, without noticing that the second thing was often manufactured under pressure, purely to end the discomfort of the first. This is worth naming precisely because it's one of the most consistent differences between people who learn quickly and people who don't. It isn't about who can tolerate more information, it's about who can tolerate more uncertainty, who can sit inside the gap between "I don't understand this yet" and "I understand this now" without rushing to close it prematurely. Consider a new manager facing a conflict between two team members that doesn't have an obvious cause. One version of that manager, uncomfortable with the ambiguity, quickly settles on the simplest available story. One of them is just difficult and moves on, because the story, even if wrong, relieves the discomfort of not knowing. Another version of that manager stays in the uncertainty longer, deliberately, asking more questions than feels natural, resisting the urge to resolve the tension with a tidy explanation before they've actually earned one. The second manager feels worse in the short term. They also end up, almost without exception, with a more accurate read of what's actually happening. This is the trade that sits at the center of this chapter, and it's a genuinely difficult one, because it asks something that runs against a basic human instinct. Confusion is not a neutral, comfortable sensation. It registers mildly but unmistakably as a kind of threat, a sign that the world isn't behaving as expected, which is precisely the kind of signal a brain is built to resolve as fast as possible. Tolerating that signal, rather than immediately quieting it, requires actively overriding something that has been running since long before conscious thought was involved. There's a specific reason this matters more than it might initially seem to. Premature answers don't just fail to help. They actively block better ones from arriving, because once a mind has settled on an explanation, however weak, it stops actively searching. The discomfort is gone, which means the incentive to keep investigating is gone with it. This is why so many problems that seem, in hindsight, to have had an obvious better answer went unsolved for so long, not because the better answer was hard to find, but because everyone involved reached for a comfortable answer early and stopped looking the moment the discomfort lifted. Fields built around genuine discovery understand this dynamic explicitly, even if they rarely describe it in these terms. Researchers are trained, often painstakingly, to resist the pull toward an early conclusion, precisely because the early conclusion is almost always shaped more by the need for relief than by the evidence itself. The willingness to say, out loud, "I don't know yet, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise," is treated, in serious research environments, as a form of rigor rather than a form of weakness. Outside those environments, in most ordinary workplaces, the opposite is often rewarded. Confidence is prized, uncertainty is quietly penalized, and people learn early to project understanding, whether or not it's genuinely there. This creates a strange incentive that pulls directly against real learning. In many careers, looking like you understand something is rewarded faster and more visibly than actually understanding it, which means an entire ecosystem of skilled people can spend years being reinforced for the appearance of clarity, while the harder, slower, less visible skill of tolerating genuine uncertainty goes almost completely unrewarded right up until the moment it matters most. There's a quiet habit that seems to distinguish people who've built real tolerance for this discomfort, and it's less about a technique and more about a permission they've given themselves. They allow themselves to say, in professional settings, some version of, "I need to think about this more before I answer," without treating that sentence as an admission of failure. Most people avoid that sentence instinctively because it feels like exposing a gap. The people who learn fastest have come to see it as the opposite, a sign of someone taking the problem seriously enough not to rush it. This doesn't mean confusion should be prolonged indefinitely or that decisiveness has no value. Plenty of situations genuinely require a fast, imperfect answer over a slow, perfect one. The distinction that matters is whether the fast answer was chosen because the situation demanded speed or because the discomfort of not knowing became unbearable before the actual thinking was finished. Those two things are often mistaken for each other, and only one of them produces real learning. What starts to become visible here is that fast learning was never really about processing information quickly. It was about extending the amount of time someone can remain honestly uncertain before reaching for relief. That extended window, uncomfortable, unglamorous, rarely discussed, is where almost all real understanding actually gets built. But tolerating discomfort is only half of what makes this work. The other half is even less intuitive, and it involves something most people actively resist: letting go of beliefs that once served them well, simply because they no longer fit what's actually true. There's a specific kind of mistake that only shows up in people who have already succeeded once, and it's easy to miss because it looks exactly like competence. A manager built their early career on being decisive, making fast calls, trusting their gut, moving before the data was complete. It worked. It got them promoted. And somewhere along the way, trust your gut and move fast stopped being a strategy that worked in a particular context and became, quietly, a permanent part of how they saw themselves. Years later, in a much larger role where fast decisions now affect hundreds of people instead of a handful, that same instinct starts producing worse outcomes. The strategy hasn't changed, the context has, but changing the strategy would mean admitting that something which used to define their success no longer fits, and that admission turns out to be far harder than learning something new from scratch. This is the part of learning almost nobody prepares for, because most conversations about growth focus entirely on adding. Read more, learn a new skill, pick up a new habit. All of that assumes the main obstacle is a lack of information. But for anyone who has already achieved some success, the more common obstacle isn't a lack of information. It's an excess of outdated conclusions, each one earned honestly, each one once useful, each one now quietly working against them. Unlearning is a different psychological task than learning, and it deserves to be treated as its own skill rather than a footnote to the others. Learning something new asks a person to add a belief to an empty space. Unlearning asks them to remove a belief that's currently occupying that space, one that likely helped build whatever success they currently have. That's a fundamentally harder request because it isn't just intellectual. It touches identity in a very specific way. Not was I wrong, but was I wrong about the very thing that made me who I am? Consider how this plays out in something as ordinary as management style. A leader who rose through the ranks by being the most technically capable person in the room often carries that identity into leadership itself, believing their value still comes from having the best answer. This worked when they were an individual contributor. As a leader, the same instinct becomes a liability. It means they answer questions their team should be answering themselves. And slowly, without meaning to, they train their team to stop thinking independently. The belief that once made them exceptional becomes the exact thing holding their team back. And letting go of it means letting go of the identity that got them promoted in the first place. This is why unlearning is disproportionately hard for people who have already succeeded, rather than easy, as intuition might suggest. Success doesn't just produce results, it produces conviction. And conviction, once formed, resists updating with a force roughly proportional to how much it's been rewarded in the past. The more a belief has paid off, the more expensive it becomes to question, which means the people most in need of updating their thinking are often the ones least willing to consider it, precisely because their thinking has worked so well for so long. There's a useful distinction that separates people who manage to unlearn well from people who get stuck defending outdated instincts indefinitely. It has to do with what they attribute past success to. Someone who believes, "I succeeded because I am naturally decisive," will defend decisiveness as a fixed trait worth protecting, in every context, indefinitely. Someone who believes decisiveness worked in that specific situation for those specific reasons holds the same past success far more loosely, because they've correctly located the value in the context rather than in themselves. When the context changes, the second person notices immediately. The first person often doesn't notice at all because, as far as they're concerned, the trait that worked before should always work again. This offers a concrete, learnable move for approaching one's own track record differently. Rather than asking after a win, "What does this say about me?" it's far more useful to ask, "What specifically about this situation made this approach effective, and how likely is that same situation to repeat?" That question keeps success attached to context instead of identity, which makes it far easier to set aside later if the context shifts and the old approach stops working. There's something almost unfair about how invisible this problem is. Unlike a skill gap, which usually announces itself through visible failure, an outdated belief that once worked can continue producing decent results for a long time, even after it stopped being the best available approach. Because decent doesn't create the kind of clear signal that failure does. This is why unlearning often requires someone to act before the evidence is undeniable, based on a quieter, less certain feeling that something isn't fitting quite as well as it used to. That requires a kind of intellectual honesty most people only apply to others, rarely to themselves. What emerges from this is a slightly uncomfortable but clarifying idea. The skills that built someone's early success are not guaranteed to be the skills that sustain it. At some point, nearly everyone who continues growing has to consciously set down a belief that once worked extremely well, simply because the world in front of them has quietly changed, and that belief hasn't changed with it. This closes the loop that's been building across every chapter so far, tolerating discomfort, absorbing correction, borrowing other people's mistakes, resisting the pull of premature certainty, and now letting go of beliefs that have outlived their usefulness. Each of these, on its own, looks like a separate skill. Together, they form something more precise, a repeatable cycle that fast learners run, almost without noticing, every time they encounter something new. It's time to name that cycle directly and see how clearly it explains everything observed so far. Step back for a moment from everything covered so far, and a pattern starts to emerge that no single chapter fully captured on its own. The person who reframes competence away from identity. The person who receives feedback as information rather than judgment. The person who seeks out other people's failures before making their own. The person who tolerates confusion instead of resolving it prematurely. The person who lets go of beliefs that once worked, once they stop fitting. These were never 5 unrelated habits. They were 5 visible pieces of one underlying cycle, a loop that fast learners run continuously, usually without ever describing it to themselves in words. Call it the update loop. It has 4 stages, and they repeat in the same order every time, in every field, at every level of experience, whether the person running it is aware of it or not. The first stage is exposure. Something new arrives, a piece of feedback, a result that didn't match expectations, a mistake someone else made, a fact that contradicts what was previously believed. This stage isn't optional and isn't rare. It happens constantly, dozens of times a day, in every job and every relationship. The raw material for learning is almost never in short supply. What varies is what happens next. The second stage is absorb. This is where the earlier chapters on feedback and discomfort matter most. Absorbing means letting the new information register as information, rather than immediately converting it into a threat to be managed or a story to be defended against. This is the stage where most people quietly exit the loop without realizing it, not because they lack the ability to absorb, but because the discomfort of doing so triggers an automatic retreat towards something more comfortable before absorption can finish. The third stage is discard. This is the least discussed and most difficult stage, and it's the one explored just before this framework. Absorbing new information often isn't enough on its own, because the mind is already occupied by an older belief that the new information contradicts. Discarding means actively releasing that older belief, even when it once worked, even when it's tied to a version of identity built over years. This is where unlearning happens. And it's the stage most responsible for why intelligent, experienced people sometimes learn more slowly than newcomers with far less at stake. The fourth stage is apply. This is where the updated understanding gets tested against reality again, producing a new result, which becomes the next stage's exposure, and the loop begins again. Apply is often mistaken for the entire process because it's the only stage anyone else can see. But apply is only as good as what happened in the 3 stages before it. A person who applies confidently without having genuinely absorbed or discarded anything isn't running the loop. They're simply repeating themselves with more conviction. What makes this loop worth naming explicitly is what happens when you compare 2 people running it at different speeds. Both encounter the same amount of exposure, the same number of corrections, mistakes, and contradicting facts over the course of a year. One of them completes the loop dozens of times, absorbing quickly, discarding readily, applying and re-exposing constantly. The other gets stuck again and again at absorb or discard, receiving the same information repeatedly without ever fully processing it, defending the same outdated belief across a decade of otherwise changing evidence. From the outside, both people look like they're getting experience, Only one of them is actually converting that experience into growth. This reframes something important about the entire subject of this audiobook. Fast learning was never about consuming more information faster. Plenty of slow learners read constantly, attend every seminar, take extensive notes. The bottleneck was never at exposure. It was almost always further down the loop, at the two stages that require emotional tolerance rather than intellectual capacity. Absorb, which requires tolerating the sting of correction, and discard, which requires tolerating the loss of a belief that once felt like part of who you are. This also explains why the loop tends to slow down exactly when it should be speeding up, later in a career, after real success has been achieved. Early on, there's little built up to defend. Every stage of the loop moves relatively freely because identity hasn't yet fused with any particular belief or method. As success accumulates, so does the psychological cost of absorb and discard, because now there's a reputation, a self-image, a track record attached to the beliefs being challenged. The loop that once ran quickly, almost automatically, starts to stick, not from lack of ability, but from the accumulated weight of everything a person has to set aside in order to keep it moving. Seen this way, the entire difference between people who keep growing across a long career and people who plateau after early success isn't a difference in talent, opportunity, or even effort. It's a difference in whether the update loop keeps turning freely or whether it quietly seizes up under the weight of everything a person has already achieved. The advantage, then, was never really about learning faster in the way that phrase usually gets used. Faster reading, faster memorization, faster consumption. It was about keeping this one particular loop moving, deliberately, at every stage, for longer than most people are willing to. Go back to the two people who started on the same day, in the same job, with the same starting point. By now, the gap between them no longer needs much explaining. One of them ran the loop. Correction arrived, and instead of defending against it, they let it in. An outdated instinct stopped working, and instead of protecting it because it once felt like part of who they were, they set it down. Someone else's mistake crossed their path, and instead of needing to make the same one personally before believing it, they simply believed it and adjusted. None of this happened in one dramatic moment. It happened in dozens of small, unremarkable moments, repeated often enough that they eventually produced a visible gap, the kind that looks from a distance like talent, and up close turns out to be something far more ordinary and far more available. The other person wasn't slower, less capable, or less deserving. They were simply protecting something, a self-image, a comfortable certainty, an identity built around already knowing, at exactly the moments when protecting it cost them the most. This is worth saying plainly, because it removes something that quietly weighs on a lot of thoughtful people. The fear that being overtaken by someone else means being fundamentally less capable. Almost never. It usually means someone else's loop was simply turning, and theirs, for a while, had quietly stopped. This changes what the modern advantage actually means, and it's worth being precise about it now that the whole picture is visible. It was never a claim about intelligence, and it was never a claim about hustle. It was a claim about a specific, learnable relationship with being wrong. One most people are never taught, and some people build almost by accident, simply because their early circumstances happen to make correction cheap rather than threatening. That means it was never reserved for a certain kind of person. It's available starting now, in the next piece of feedback that arrives, in the next moment of confusion that could be resolved too quickly or sat with a little longer, in the next outdated belief that quietly needs to be set down rather than defended. None of these moments require permission, resources, or a particular starting point. They only require a willingness to let something in that would have been easier to keep out. There's a final distinction worth carrying forward, because it changes how all of this feels rather than just what it means. This was never about becoming someone who knows more. It's about becoming someone who updates more readily. Someone whose relationship to their own beliefs stays a little looser, a little less defended, a little more willing to be revised by whatever shows up next. Knowing more is a snapshot. Updating well is a practice, and practices, unlike snapshots, keep paying out for as long as they're kept up. So the real question this audiobook has been circling from the very beginning was never, why do some people learn faster? It was always closer to this. What would change in your own work, your own relationships, your own sense of who you are, if being wrong stopped feeling like something to defend against and started feeling like the ordinary cost of getting somewhere better than where you started? That shift doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives the next time someone corrects you and you let it in a little sooner than you would have before.